The reason we think leases is important, everyone, is because there's always been a controversy as to why companies are not putting their obligations and the related assets on their balance sheets related especially to long-term leases, okay? And this has been a battle between the FASB, the IASB, the International Accounting Standards Board, and corporations since Phil and I got out of school, okay? Is firms were doing everything they could to keep leases off their balance sheets, okay? So finally, the IASB and FASB picked up this topic about 10 years ago, and they issued a whole bunch of drafts. There were thousands of comment letters, and they issued a standard a few years ago, okay? And now all publicly listed companies are required to do what you will see from us today, okay? And by the way, I used to be a writer for the CPA exam for FAR, and I have written some of the questions on leases, okay? Obviously, we cannot disclose them to you here, okay? Because that would break my confidentiality agreement. Yeah. But I want you to know that it's possible to get simulation question on leases now and or plus multiple choice questions. So that's why Phil and I think this is such an important topic today, because it's a big footnote in most publicly listed companies' financial statements. 2 of your handouts, right? Let's briefly go through accounting for leases, right? And we know that a lease is a contract which offers the right to control the use of some type of identified asset for some period, for some type of consideration, obviously money, right? Rent or whatever it might be. The right to control the use of that leased asset means that the lessee has the right to obtain substantially all the economic benefits from the use of that asset and the right to direct the use of the asset. In other words, they have decision-making authority over that asset, right? So this could be an apartment building, right? This could be equipment. This could be IT equipment, right? It could be anything, okay? Real and tangible personal property of just about any sort. An identified asset must be explicitly or implicitly stated, and the supplier lessor must not be able to substitute the asset during the term of the lease, okay, except for repairs or warranty. Okay, so that's our criteria for accounting for leases to meet this new standard. Okay, so in the past, for those of you that remember lease accounting from the past, deciding if a lease was an operating or financing lease was important because it determined if the asset and the liability needed to go on the balance sheet. Now it is.
Excuse me one second.
Yeah.
That at first I read that and I thought that's not correct. But back then it says you're deciding if the lease is an operating or financing lease is now very important. Now. Okay?
Yes. Yes.
All right? Because the leases used to be what? Operating and what? Capital leases.
And capital leases. They're no longer capital leases, okay? They're either an operating lease or a financing lease these days. Okay, so now it's important to determine if the contract is a lease or not. If it is a lease with a term over 12 months, okay, you must recognize it on the balance sheet. That's a big change in this lease accounting. And we're going to show you, Phil and I, an example of how to do that, okay? If not, it can be expensed like a regular operating lease, okay? Page 3.
All right, now, the classification of leases, all right?
And that's the blueprint, right, Phil?
Right,
that's
this is
the blueprint.
The ASC blueprint. Identify the criteria for classifying a lease arrangement. Now, please remember this. It is the lessee that determines what the lease is. For example, if the lessee determines it's a finance lease, then the lessor either shows it as a sale lease, all right, or a direct financing lease, okay? All right, and we'll talk about direct financing leases later. Basically what that is where a third party guarantees the residual value to the lessor, all right? All right, now in a lot of cases, who guarantees or not guarantees the residual value? It's the who? Lessee, all right?
Yep.
So notice, if the lessee meets certain requirements, and it's one of these owns requirements, then the lessee will treat it as a what? capital, no, I said capital lease, finance lease, right?
Mhm.
And then the what? The lessor will treat it either as a sales type or direct financing. Okay? All right. Now, this really is the same as basically to determine if a lease was a capital lease to a lessee. But now it's called a finance lease. And, all right, I use this mnemonic that says owns. Okay? All right. All right. Can I look at the board a second? Can you show me? Am I on?
Yep.
All right. All right. There's Ron. All right. Okay. All right. Can they see me on the board with the board?
Oh, yes, we can see you.
Thank you very much. And there's the marker that doesn't work. Okay. All right. That's my fault. I left it out. Let me get another marker here. All right. Now, if the lessee meets one of the owns requirement, okay. All right. That's O, W, all right, N, S. And there's a new one called the AU test. Okay. Now, the first test says if the lessee can get the right of ownership at the end of the lease, it doesn't mean the lessee has to buy it, but if the lessee has the option, all right, to buy it from the lessor at the end of the lease, then you meet the O test, and that's one of the requirements for the lessee to record it as a finance lease. Now, if you don't meet the O test, all right, let's see if the lessee meets the W test. Is there a written bargain purchase option? Now, that means this. When the lease is over, okay, the lessee can either return the asset to the lessor or the lessee possibly could buy it out. All right. Now, in order for the lessee to meet the bargain purchase agreement, all right, the lessee has to be able to have the right to buy it out for less than fair market value. All right. The lessee's got to get a bargain over other people might be able to purchase the thing. Now,
Hey, Phil, wait a second. Your video is paused.
have to be 90% or more of the assets fair market value. All right. Now, the present value of the lease payments. Now, you can have two present value tables. One, if the first payment is made at the end of the period, not when the lease is entered into, that's called an ordinary annuity. But if the lessee enters into a lease with the lessor and they enter into it January 1st, 20x1, and the first payment is January 1st, 20x1, that's called an annuity due. Okay? All right. Now, another term for annuity due is called an annuity in advance. All right. So if you want to get the present value, what that thing is worth today, all right, and the lessee is going to start the payments on the date they enter into the lease, all right, what the lessee will do is take the payment, all right, and multiply it by a factor in the present value tables. Now, if it's an annuity due, all right, what is the lessee going to do? First of all, to go to that table, all right, present value of an annuity, and they want to look at this. First of all, the number of periods that you will be leasing the asset. Don't use the useful life of the asset, because remember, you're really just leasing it during the period. That's why we set up this right of use asset. I'll show you that in a second, which really says, hey, a right of use asset says when you lease something, whether it's an operating lease or a finance lease, you're just leasing it for the term of the lease. The right, you want to use it, okay? All right, now, what happens? All right, here we go. You go to the present value table of an annuity due. You look for the number of years of the lease, all right? You look at the interest rate. Now, the interest rate can say, all right, one of three things. It can say the rate of return is 8%, or it could say the implicit rate is 7%, or it could say the incremental rate. Now, you are going to use one of those rates. Now, if they give you an implicit rate of, say, 6%, all right, but the incremental rate I'm sorry. All right. The incremental rate, I'll define what these are in a second for you. The incremental rate is 5%. Now, what's the definition of the implicit rate? The implicit rate is the rate that the lessor is really charging the lessee. All right. And in this case, the lessee may know it or not. All right. Because remember, who determines the implicit rate? The lessor. So if the lessee never sees the lease agreement, all right, then he can't be aware of the implicit rate. The incremental rate is the rate that the lessee would actually have to pay for a loan if they were borrowing the money to buy the asset. Now, what's the deal here? The lessee, when he goes to the present value tables, has to use the lesser of the implicit rate or the incremental rate. Now, in this case, they would use the what? Incremental rate. Now, remember this, all right? Let's assume that the implicit rate is now 4%, all right? So you say, well, they'd use the 4% rate. Remember this, all right? The lessee can only use the implicit rate if they know about it, all right? Now, if the lessee does not know about this 4%, even though it's lower than the incremental, then, all right, the lessee will use what? A 5% rate. So remember, when it comes to determining the rate you go to the present value tables, it's the lesser of the implicit rate or incremental rate. But you can only use the implicit rate if less, as long as the lessee knows about it. Because the implicit rate is whose rate? The lessor. Okay? All right. And then we have, to moving along, we have the 75% test. All right. That means that the lease term must be at least 75% of the normal economic life. Okay? All right. Just remember, S for 75. And then if you don't meet the O, W, and S, you still have one more test. The less can say alternate use test. And what's the alternate use test?
Thank you for previewing the Yaeger CPA Review course materials. To learn more or to purchase the full course, visit YaegerCPAReview.com or click the link in the description.